My name is Peter Anker, or Peder Anker. I'm at NYU. I'm a historian of science. I'm going to chair this session. Thank you so much for the organizers for organizing this amazing conference. I'm just going to put that on the table. Our session is called Fields and Beaches, and we'll go on from now till 4:15. And I'll try to actually cut it up at 4:15 for those who have plans and things. So we will be on time. I'm super proud to introduce our two main speakers today. Our first speaker is going to be Emanuele Coccia, an associate professor at the École des Hautes de Sciences Sociales at Paris. He has published many books and articles that will make us all blush. I just want to point out your latest book, La Vie de Plomb for 2016. Please go ahead.
So, we have a starter look at politics. We usually focus on cities. It is from the word city in ancient Greek that the word politics comes, as all know, and we forget the rest of the earth entirely. We cannot recognize that every city is only the visible place of a larger agricultural and zootechnical project, which are their presuppositions, even if they lie outside its walls. There is no city that can live without the interspecific encounter of women, men, plants, and animals that every meal celebrates. Every city lives on the body of plants and animals which are necessary to give life to all women and men who live in it. The Leviathan is also composed of all those animal and vegetal bodies. They are giving their entire power to the body politics. And conversely, there is no politics that is not the management of the relationship of this interspecific body to body. We have a distorted view of cities. We usually consider that the city is a modified space, a designed space, and therefore different to every other kind of space in the world. We usually consider cities as a space of concentration of bodies belonging to a single species, the human one, and we forget that these bodies are the daily reincarnation of all the chickens, salmon, cows, wheat, barley, corn that each of them consumes. These distortions are plunged into prejudices, that for which politics is always and only an intraspecific fact, a human all-to-human business, and that for which only human beings would be capable of politics, because only human beings are capable of modifying their own environment, the space in which they live. The identity of agriculture or animal husbandry and politics was evident in the Platonic tradition, on the contrary, which often compared politics to the pastoral model. But the modern revival of the pastoral metaphor, especially in Foucault, seems to forget that the most important fact, that the shepherd does not share the same species with his flock. Pastorality, husbandry, and agriculture are the beginning of every form of politics, not because the beginning of agriculture coincides with the foundation of the earliest urban settlements. Husbandry and agriculture are the transcendental form of all kinds of politics. More generally, any association of individuals of the same species assumes the joint association of individuals of other species and other kingdoms. Not only is each city an interspecific association, an inter-kingdom association, that's why agriculture is much more interesting than husbandry, but it is an association of a technical nature which has nothing natural about it. Just as the association of men among them is not something natural, but something technical. That means again that the Earth is composed by cities and not by ecosystems. There are cities everywhere beyond the human ones. And conversely, what I want to show is also that the very existence of every species is a political project or an urban program on the world. So, the identity between politics and agriculture means that recognizing that politics is always an interspecific and interkingdom does not only result in all living beings participating in politics. The other great consequence, which we curiously have difficulty admitting, is that agriculture is a cosmic fact. It never concerns only the relationship between two species in a specific place, but it is the transcendental form of all species, a relationship that allows the genesis of the world every time. The genesis of the world is indeed a form of interspecific relationship and not an emergency of a single individual or a single species. There is no world where there is only one form of life. The world is a product of agriculture, of an interspecific relationship, of a cosmic agriculture. Now, in order to show how to think something like a cosmic agriculture, I will proceed in two steps, following two objects, air and flowers. First, I will show that there is not such a thing like a natural space because every centimeter of space has been designed by others. That's what air teaches us. Secondly, I will argue that to design the space of others means necessary to design their life. In this sense, to be the architect of another species world means to be its farmer or its breeder, and this relationship is not limited to humanity. Every species is the farmer or the breeder of other species. In a way, architecture is not a purely human activity, but something which coincides with the most elementary acts of living. It is everywhere, not only in every species, but also in every single gesture of every single species. First point, there is not such a thing like a natural environment. The world is always in all its parts designed, and what is more important, space is always designed by other species, and for other species than the one who is living in the space. That's the reason why the relationships to the world are never barely physical nor natural, but they cannot be but political. To be in the world means for every species to live in the space designed and conceived of and by other species. It means to occupy, to invade it, and to negotiate together what could it be a common shared space. Let's start from the most common, the most trivial phenomenon of the living, or at least of animals, breath. Our relationship to the world is first of all an aerial one. The space is first of all not just a walkable space, a visible space, a touchable space. Every habitable space has to be a breathable space. Space is first of all the object of breathing, food for our lungs. For this reason, the very first, the original, and most primitive architectural act is not the building of walls, it is the air conditioning. We are used to thinking of breathing as the most natural of movements, the most obvious, ordinary, natural relationship that binds us to the world and to space, and we are used to thinking of air as the most natural of elements, what exists in its purest form beyond every act of manipulating nature. And yet the air, with its 22% oxygen content, is nothing but a byproduct of plant life. It is what results from their metabolism, the garbage produced by their existence. In other words, it is a design entity, a design product. What is more interesting is the fact that it is a secondary result of a plan, of a project over the world, and it is coming not even from men, or not even from individuals belonging to species related to humanity. And yet, it is only because of this accidental, not human design that the world is livable for us. We know that the definitive settlement of animal beings on land was possible only thanks to the radical transformation of the airspace surrounding and enclosing the earth crust produced by the plant invasion and the activity of cyanobacteria. Only thanks to the oxygen produced by photosynthesis, the earthly atmosphere could change durably its internal composition and become the first environment of all animal beings. Only thanks to plants. I already tried to show that this fact shows that the world is a vegetal entity, much more than a zoological one, that the world is a garden rather than a zoo, and it is only because it is a garden that we can live in it. And if the world is a garden, plants are not just the content of this garden or their inhabitants. The plants are the gardeners themselves. To acknowledge that plants are the gardener the gardeners, means that Earth has nothing original, nothing natural. It is an object of gardening. That means that also that we as all other animals are the object of the gardening action of plants. We are one of their cultural and agricultural products. Translated into more familiar terms, plants are not landscape, they are the original and the very first landscaper. Now, I want to take this very simple fact in order to generalize that and to take it as a paradigmatic example of the relationship between a species and a space. If I'm doing that, it is because they are not just plants who are producing the face of our world, shaping and reshaping the earth, but every single living entity. Architectural or urban agency, that is political agencies, is not something limited to human beings. It is the most general faculty of living beings, firstly. Secondly, architectural or urban agency is never an exclusively intraspecific activity. It always implies a new relationship among all species of the world. To be alive doesn't mean to perceive the world differently from other species. It means to build, to construct, to shape the world differently. The environment is not something that pre-exists natural species. It is something that every species reshapes in its own shape and likeness. The animated world is a world of architects, and we all know that. We all spend time to study the nest, the beehives, the anthill, and so on. But it's not enough to acknowledge that the designing agency of other species or the amazing architecture. What is at stake, it is not the fact that every single species shapes the world in its image and likeness. What is important is the fact that there is just one single world, and that every single species is in a way obliged to live in a world produced and designed by others, or conversely, to shape the world also and first of all for other species. That is, architecture is always a multi-species salon. It is exactly what the example of breathing teaches us. Humanity came in the world as the earth was already designed by other species and not really for the sake of humanity. Breathing means to live of something that somebody else produced and transformed into, and to produce and transform this something into our first barrel. That's exactly the point. Space, what we persist in calling the natural environment, is never natural. What we call space is always a design, a produced space, and not something which was already there, untouched and equal to itself since the beginning of time. There is someone in the world who produced the space we are living in. Secondly, and most importantly, this someone, this somebody, this architect of our common space is neither a man nor a woman nor a god. It is an individual belonging to another living species. That very simple fact means a lot. First of all, what we call design is actually the relationship between two or more species, or better, the transcendental form of the relationship between species. Since the world is the same for everybody and for every species, every designing activity is a world designing activity and is an activity which blurs the frontiers between the species, shakes the world of other species. Every time that a species produces its own world, it is also producing the world of others. Every time that a bee, an oak, a bacterium changes its own environment in order to make its own life possible, it is also changing the environment of other species. This means, first of all, that architecture is not just the active relationship between a species and the world, but the necessary relationship between all the species of the world. It is as a world architect that every single species relates to others. Architecture is not just a human affair, it is not just a cultural fact, it is not even the relationship between a species and the space, a form of life and its world, it is the paradigm of the interspecific relationship. Now, that very single fact means again a lot. It means that there is no natural relationship between species. Every relationship between species is a technical one, but it means above all that architecture is the same as agriculture or husbandry, not just the technical relationship to the space occupied by other species, but the technical link to the individuals of the other species itself and to their life. So agriculture or husbandry are not, as we keep thinking since a while, exclusively human activities. One has not to wait the Neolithic revolution in order to see a species, the human one, who domesticated other species in order to control their evolution, their shape, their way of being, and instituted therefore a technical connection with them. This kind of relationship always existed. I would like to develop or to prove this evidence speaking about plants again, or better of a very strange part of the body of some of them, flowers. If I'm speaking about them, it is not because of their beauty, but because they say a lot about the relationship of plants with architecture and with interspecific urbanism and with politics. The flowers tell us at least two things. Architecture is something which has always to do with self-constitution, and conversely, self-preservation is also an architectural activity. And secondly, in order to understand design of others, the privileged point of view is not the one of the architect, but the one of the building, the one of the design others. In more familiar terms, because I will speak about pollination, in order to understand pollination, you have to look at flowers much more than at insects. The first element to mention is the fact that, properly speaking, a flower is not an organ. It is an aggregate of different organs modified to make reproduction possible. This also explains its ephemeral and unstable nature. Imagine to have sexual organs that are structured like your hair or your nails, or even worse, like a pimple, a furuncle, a boil. That is something that grows independently from you and falls away when you have used it. Imagine that their growth is a seasonal one, linked to the outside atmosphere. Imagine what it would mean for us to have to build new sexual organs each time without being assured of their permanence. From this point of view, flowers are extremely interesting because they vividly embody the main character of plant life, the impossibility of stopping growth, the impossibility of moving toward a state different from that of work in progress, of a being under construction. To be a plant means that you are constantly producing and redesigning your body, but it means also not to be able to distinguish and divide the phase of self-constitution, of self-constructing body, the growth, and the phase of reproducing oneself, as a lot of animals do. The Goethean tradition and the current morphological biological tradition define this character by the opposition between Gestalt and Bildung, form and shaping. The non-separation between reproduction and growth is precisely the radicalization of this eminently poetic, creative, anti-practical character of plant life. It is impossible to distinguish between If it is impossible to distinguish between reproduction and growth, then it is not possible to distinguish between artificiality and naturalness. The body is never purely natural, it is always constructed. On the contrary, the construction, the poiesis, loses its artificial character since it never exceeds the boundaries of the individual body. To live as a plant always means to build and rebuild oneself. It is impossible to just inhabit the world. For that, it would be necessary to have an already completed, constructed body. Plants do not just live in the world, they constantly transform it while being immersed in it. To live would mean to make use of one's own form, but for a plant, this dimension of form using is strictly impossible. They constantly have to repair, reform, change their own body. To live is to increase, to transform light, carbon dioxide, and water into a body, to make the aerial world in its own form without ever eating nothing. One could say that the plant life is a constant and incessant act of self-design. Since there is no possible use, no stable and fixed form of life, life means always to reshape oneself and its own matter. Being itself is design, not form, but production of forms. This, I think, is the metaphysical meaning of one of the most peculiar anatomical properties of plants, namely the centrality of meristems. So plants are architects that can never distinguish between the construction of themselves and the construction of the world. In this sense, architecture is always the metamorphosis of the architects, and the paradigm of the architectural relationship to the world is the cocoon of the pupa of every insect. In a life where being is design, no difference can be made between praxis and poiesis, production and action. The body is always to build. Well, skip some points in order to go to the end. So the idea is that the life of plants is a sort of meta-organic existence, a sort of somatic do-it-yourself. For life as an incessant act of somatic DIA, that's a plant. But flowers are even more interesting for what I'm trying to think, that is architecture as a paradigm of the interspecific relationship. 5 minutes. Now, I skip some. So, in order to understand flowers, we have to think that flowers are the exact opposite of consciousness. Consciousness is an instrument of interiorization of the world. It miniaturizes, so to speak, what goes on outside in order to control, to allow a decision. It's an instrument of taking power over space and especially over the future. A flower, on the contrary, is the construction of a trompe-l'œil space, a poor appearance that does not serve to internalize the surrounding world, nor to master it, but to produce a pure surface of conjunction, of arrangement. Certainly, we can see, as for instance Francis Allais did in flowers, a mechanism for manipulating other species. But there is in a flower an additional exposure to the external world, to chance, to the decision of others. Rather than seeing in it the intelligence of manipulation, I would propose to conceive flowers as the much superior intelligence of an abandonment and trust in the world, as an act of intelligence to delegate to others the decision about its own destiny. In the flower, indeed, the reproduction ceases to be an instrument at the service of the individual or specific narcissism to become ecology of the condensation and the mixture, since the individual, if one can still call it this way, allow that the world and the whole world is giving birth to its newborns. The relationship between individuals of the same species is mediated by the relationship to other individuals of different kingdom, genera, and species, flowers and insects. Not only there is nothing private or occult in the sexual act, but it requires precisely to go through the world. Sexuality is the most mundane and cosmic act for flowers. The encounter with the other is always necessarily union with the world in its diversity of forms, status, substance, insects, wind, water, and animals of different sorts. In this case, to be locked in an identity of gender, species, of kingdom is simply not possible, because sexuality appears as a relaxation of identity. From this perspective, the flower also has a peculiar structure which is exactly at the opposite to what we call tool or instrument. According to Ernst Kapp's classical definition, the instrument, the tool, is a projection outside the body of an organic structure. This is the classic theory of the Organsprojektion, which sees in the hammer a projection of the first, in the glasses the projection of the eyes, in the computer the projection of the brain. This X-reflection allows to prolong the action of the subject in the world, so to appropriate it, to decide the destiny of the surrounding objects according to the goal of the acting subject. The flower, on the contrary, does not project its organism outside, but builds something like a space of landing so that the world can arrive and rest there. Above all, this non-organ, this non-instrument, puts its destiny in the hands of and lives of others. Everything happens as if the flowers open to an anti-instrumental, anti-organic dimension. Above all, the flowers steers in a very particular way the relationship of the individual to the surrounding world, or to put it better, to the surrounding species. There is what we could call a sort of inverted agriculture or inverted husbandry, an opening in which other species become farmers, or better, geneticists, breeders, deciding who gets involved with whom, who is mating with whom, and so on. Donna Haraway with her concept of becoming with a companion species, Natasha Myers with the notion of involuntary momentum, have already made it possible to think of this interspecific opening that is manifested with such force in plants and flowers. But the idea of becoming with tries again to reintroduce a sort of natural, non-technical, purely social relationship, and reserves only to human the supposedly atrocious technical exploitation of others. I would like to suggest that technical relationships to other species, agriculture, husbandry, breeding, is not something purely human, but the normal and transcendental form of interspecific relationship in the world. And that is just because of the architectural relationship that every species has to have with the world. It is only because every species has an architectural agency on the world, and only because there is just one world for all species, that this architectural relationship to the world become an interspecific agriculture or an interspecific husbandry which has no limit. But something, it seems to me, still remains to think in flowers. The organic structure of flowers breaks both the idea of sexual selection in the sense of Darwin and the idea of natural selection in general. The idea of sexual selection, as Darwin put it, is broken to that extent that here competition takes place between beings of different kinds, of different genera, of different kingdom. Above all, the very idea of a natural selection is also broken because the pollinator, the insect, takes the same position here as the farmer. It operates an artificial selection, or more precisely, puts an end to the opposition between artificial and natural selection. Agriculture and natural history are not in opposition. Man is not alone in influencing and determining the fate of species. Every species probably decides in its own way the evolutionary fate of others. What we call evolution is nothing more than a kind of generalized interspecific agriculture, a cosmic interbreeding, which is not necessarily intended to be useful. The world in its totality thus becomes a kind of purely relational reality where each species is the agroecological territory of the other. Every being is a gardener of other species and a garden for still others. And what we call world is only the relation of reciprocal cultivation. In this sense, there is no ecology possible because every ecosystem is the result of an agricultural practice and commitment by other species. There is no wild space, there is no wildlife, because everything is cultivated, and being in the world means to garden other species and at the same time, and with the same gesture, being the object of the gardening or the breeding of others. Thank you.